All right, I'm just going to take a minute to welcome everybody to our webinar for the International Health Economics Association. My name is David Bashai. I'm the president of the International Health Economics Association, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome our guest speaker today. Marika Cabral won the Aero Award of our association for this work, and the award committee, chaired by Chris Room and Luigi Siciliani, was very impressed with this work, and so are we all. This is a paper that was published in the Review of Economic Studies in 2017, which does an empirical test of a Nobel Prize-winning theory. And this really puts economics on par with all of the sciences, because we had a fabulous theory about demand behavior in healthcare markets. And it made a lot of sense, but then we were limited in our ability to empirically test it. And I'll let our speaker reveal to us how it came to her to run these tests and to show empirically that, yes, it's true that adverse selection occurs in markets. Dr. Cabral is an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin and a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. She received her PhD in economics from Stanford in 2011 after she had a bachelor's in economics and applied math at UC San Diego. She has done work in this area and has published in journals such as the American Economic Review and the Review of Economic Studies. So I'd like to turn it over to Marika, and I'd like to tell the audience that we will be taking your questions through the chat box. So at any time, you can put something into the chat box. I will only interrupt Dr. Cabral if something looks extremely important. Otherwise, we'll just let her finish her presentation and then take questions at the end. So I will now turn it over to Dr. Cabral. Welcome, and thank you so much.
Thanks very much, David, for that introduction. Also, following David's previous suggestion, I worked in a few spots where I was going to pause for questions. So if there's anything, David, that comes up in the meantime, I could address those questions there as we go along. So I'm very happy to have the opportunity to talk about my paper today, Claim Timing and Ex Post Adverse Selection. And with that, I'll get right into discussing the motivation for the project. So the basic motivation for this project sort of comes from the long history in economics of thinking about how asymmetric information, broadly speaking, things like moral hazard and adverse selection, occur and motivate government policy within the setting of insurance markets. In this paper, I look at a new source of asymmetric information that people have largely ignored in the prior literature, and it stems from the fact that individuals may sometimes be able to strategically delay the financial cost associated with an adverse event in order to gain more insurance benefits. So let me give a simple example to make this concrete. Suppose today I go out and play some sports and I injure myself, and that injury necessitates a medical treatment. I might think to myself, well, if the treatment's not very urgent, maybe I can put it off for a month or two, sign up for better insurance in the meantime, and then pass on more of the cost of that treatment to my insurer, so I don't have to pay as much out of pocket. If enough people are engaging in this kind of strategic delay behavior, this could really generate a lot of adverse selection and could be a big problem for the insurance market in terms of generating market unraveling. This is the kind of phenomenon that I'm interested in within this paper. There are a couple of properties within an insurance market that encourage this kind of strategic delay behavior. The first is that an individual has some control over the time lapse between the realization of the uncertain event, in my example that was the injury, and the associated financial cost. In my example, that's the treatment. So in healthcare settings, it's typically the case, at least with non-emergency medicine, that individuals have some degree of control over when they're going to do the treatment after they learn that the treatment is necessary. The second property that's important here is that insurance coverage is determined by the date that the financial cost is incurred. So in my example, it's my insurance status on the date of the treatment that matters for the coverage of the treatment. It's not my insurance status on the date that I get injured. That's a common thing in healthcare markets. In healthcare markets, typically insurers use the date of the financial cost itself or the date of the treatment to determine your coverage, as opposed to the date that you start to feel pain or the date that you start to feel ill. There could be lots of reasons for that, but practically speaking, it's often hard to verify and contract on the date that you start to feel pain or you start to feel ill. So there are several insurance settings in which insurers use the date of the cost to determine coverage, and these kinds of issues can arise. So health-related insurance settings are the ones that come to mind here. So things like dental, vision, medical insurance, prescription drug insurance. We can contrast these with insurance settings where this doesn't really happen. And the reason why is that insurers in some setting could actually see and contract on the adverse event itself. So think about something like automobile insurance. If I get in an auto accident today, it's going to be my insurance status today that matters for the coverage of the accident. It's not going to be my insurance status on the date that I go fix my car, after the accident. So the insurance on later dates doesn't really matter for my coverage, or it doesn't matter at all for my coverage of the accident that happens today. And so in those kind of settings, we don't have this kind of strategic delay incentive, versus in sort of healthcare settings, this kind of strategic delay incentive could cause potentially a lot of market unraveling. So to make this clear why this could matter in equilibrium, let me go through just a very simple example. Suppose that you have a risk-averse population of individuals who all look ex-ante identical in terms of risk. They all have homogeneous per-period risk that they're facing. But suppose half the people in this population are flexible in the sense they can delay a cost for one period if something bad happens this period. So if a problem arises, they can delay treatment for one period. Let's contrast two scenarios. In scenario one, the insurer can contract on the date of the event, the adverse event itself. If that's the case, everybody in the population would be happy to buy full insurance in per-period contracts that are priced at average cost. Basically, they're all risk-averse and they like to buy actuarially fair coverage. But if instead we're in scenario two, where insurers can only contract on the date that the cost occurs, the market for this per-period insurance may start to unravel. And the intuition is simple. The flexible individuals in the population would think to themselves, well, I'm not going to buy insurance in any given period. If something goes wrong and a problem arises, I'll delay treating it for one period and buy insurance right before I treat the problem. And if enough people engage in this kind of opting in and opting out selectively, we could see insurer costs go up significantly and premiums go up significantly, so much so that perhaps these inflexible individuals would never decide to insure and the market could fully unravel. So the basic idea here is that the strategic claim timing, which could be thought of as a form of moral hazard because it's an action that's being taken on the part of the individual that's not contractable but increases insurer costs and minimizes their out-of-pocket costs, this kind of strategic claim timing leads to subsequent adverse selection. In this paper, I call this ex-post adverse selection to differentiate it from more traditional adverse selection based on people's differences in pre-existing risk types. So strategic claim timing and ex-post adverse selection has sort of interesting implications for policy that go above and beyond sort of traditional moral hazard or traditional adverse selection. And in particular, they motivate policy instruments like that we see insurers use in practice and policymakers thinking about in this space. So for instance, it might motivate for why we would care about things like choice frequency restrictions. In particular, things like how long contracts are, how frequent open enrollment periods are. It might motivate insurers to want to use things like waiting periods. Similarly, it may motivate coverage restrictions like requirements on prior insurance status. Why would the insurer care about your prior insurance status, barring them being worried that you might have delayed treatment? Exclusions of certain types of very delayable care, and pricing of pre-existing conditions. So in this paper, what I do is I use rich claim level data from one large firm to investigate these forces in the context of insurance for dental care. I'll talk more about why it is I look at the context of dental in a moment. But what I'm going to do in the paper is I reveal evidence consistent with asymmetric information and strategic claim timing. And then I use this evidence to motivate a model that I develop and estimate to explicitly link the strategic claim timing to the adverse selection that it can generate. I then use this estimated model to investigate the relative importance of this type of adverse selection, ex-post adverse selection, as opposed to more traditional adverse selection based on differentiated ex-ante risk types. And I also use the counterfactuals to explore how various policy instruments such as the frequency of open enrollment periods and the pricing of pre-existing conditions may work to try to address this type of adverse selection. So before continuing, I want to briefly mention where I think this paper fits into the literature. I won't have time to fully go over all of the literature that's out there on adverse selection or moral hazard in health insurance, but I'll tell you where I think this fits in. So there's been recent and growing literature thinking about how to test the kind of traditional theories of asymmetric information in insurance markets and apply them to empirical context, and then think about the welfare associated with these types of market failures. And so these are just a few sites. I could really fill three slides worth of sites at a minimum. But basically, most of these studies think about asymmetric information in a static setting. What I'm going to be doing in this paper is thinking about inherently dynamic asymmetric information, and in particular, an unexplored dynamic connection between two classes of asymmetric information that people have traditionally viewed as distinct: moral hazard and adverse selection. So strategic claim timing is a form of moral hazard that generates some adverse selection, and I'm looking at that link between those two forces in this paper. This paper is also related to the smaller literature looking at dynamic inefficiencies in insurance markets. So most of that literature is focused on reclassification risk. The reclassification risk is the idea that even when you and your insurer have symmetric information about your risk, there could be dynamic inefficiencies because in reality we see short-term contracts. So people are uninsured against the long-term risk of becoming a worse risk type and thereby facing higher premiums. The commonality between the dynamic inefficiency that I look at in this paper and this reclassification risk literature is that both of these inefficiencies arise because of the lack of lifetime enforceable contracts. The key difference is that the inefficiency that I look at in this paper arises because of the inherent asymmetric information between consumers and insurers, because insurers can't contract on the underlying uncertainty and instead are stuck contracting on the treatments that they observe consumers do. So what I do in this paper is I show this dynamic asymmetric information causes large dynamic inefficiencies in these insurance markets, and it gives us an independent reason to care about things like contract length and the frequency of open enrollment periods, even if people's risk types aren't evolving over time. Okay, so it's also related to the literature looking at moral hazard and health insurance. Again, I could have filled many slides with the sites that have looked at this, but most of the kind of traditional view of moral hazard and health insurance settings is to think about it in a very sort of static sense. How much care, are people going to do care today or never based on the price that they face today? In this paper, I'm thinking about it in more of a dynamic sense. Are people going to do care this period or next period? Based on the price that they face this period versus next period. So I'm estimating sort of dynamic moral hazard, and then I'm linking that to the consequences for the insurance market in terms of adverse selection. And then lastly, this is also related to the literature that looks at individual decision-making in insurance settings and related contexts like retirement plan selection. So most of that literature has looked at how people may respond to changes and forces that are external to them, like changes in the prices of available options, changes in default, changes in option sets. What I'm going to be looking at is how people's insurance decisions respond to changes that are internal to them, like health shocks that they have yet to treat, but they plan to treat in the future. And so largely this literature, the prior literature, has found that people are quite myopic when it comes to changes in external forces in many cases. What I'm going to find that people in this study is that people seem to be quite strategic when it comes to changes in internal forces like their stock of untreated health problems that they've accumulated. So I look at this within the context of dental, and I think this is a natural first context to look for these forces for two reasons. The first is that it's a relatively simple context in which treatments can be delayed, oftentimes by weeks, months, or even longer. And the second is that there's a real puzzle to be explained here. Dental risk in the United States is largely uninsured, and that's in contrast to other risks that you might think are out there, for example, sort of broader medical risk or prescription drugs, etc. And so I'll talk more about why it is that it's largely uninsured, but basically very few people have coverage, and even those who have coverage have this kind of strange coverage that's not really insurance. And so what I'm going to argue in this paper is that it seems to be that this type of asymmetric information may explain why we see that this risk is largely uninsured in practice. So a bit more background on dental. In 2007, Americans spent $95.2 billion on dental care, or about $315 per capita. 40% of people have dental coverage, and almost all of them get it through their employers. So this is really an employer-provided fringe benefit. Dental insurance, and I put insurance here in quotes for a reason, is very incomplete insurance. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that insurance policies typically state that you have an annual maximum benefit. On average, that was $1,100 back in 2007. And so what that means is that after the insurer has spent $1,100 on your behalf, the insurer is going to spend no more on your behalf. You're going to have to pay 100% out of pocket. So it's kind of the opposite of what we normally think about insurance as being. Instead of capping the losses of the individual, it's capping the losses of the insurer. So it's a very sort of strange product. That's why I put it in quotes here, sort of insurance. But regardless, the overall sort of stylized fact here is that only 40% of people have any coverage, and that coverage looks very incomplete relative to the types of insurance products that might seem optimal more generally. And so I'll argue that this type of asymmetric information that I point out in this paper could largely explain why it is that we don't see more comprehensive insurance in this setting. So where I'm going to be going with the rest of the talk is I'm going to tell you about what I do with the empirical analysis in the paper. I'm going to first talk about some evidence of incentivized behavior that's like sort of fairly transparent evidence that suggests people may be strategically timing claims and using that information to select their insurance coverage. I'm then going to talk about the model that I develop and estimate, and then I'll use the estimated model to explore some counterfactual policy analysis. I wanted to, David told me to put in breaks here for questions, so I wanted to pause if there were any questions, or should I continue, David?
Well, I'm going to make sure that the chat box stays open for anybody with questions. I don't see any right now, and you've already promised to answer my question, which is to connect your empirical work with our concerns that insurance coverage has this very low stop loss and isn't a very good product. I'm looking forward to that explanation.
Okay. I hope I give you a satisfactory one as I go along then. So I'll keep going, and I'll I think make one more break, and then of course we can stop at the end and answer any questions if they come up then. Okay, so a bit more background on the setting that I'm looking at. So what I'm going to do in this paper is use claims data for employees and dependents of one large manufacturing firm. The claims data includes financial information like the total and out-of-pocket cost of the service, the date of the service, and the description of the service. I also have information on coverage for these employees and dependents. What plan are they on? What plans were on the menu that they were able to choose from? And what coverage tier? So is an employee a single employee, or do they cover dependents? The company offers 70% of its U.S. employees 2 options for dental coverage. What I call here Plan L and Plan H for the low plan and the high plan. The high plan is strictly more generous than the low plan. Conveniently, the low plan is free for employees and dependents. That means that everybody's dental claims show up in the data. It's not just sort of a selected sample. The company does something kind of weird during this time period. People's plan selections are locked in between 2005 and 2006, so there's 2-year commitment to the plan for that time period. But before that and after that, they had 1-year commitment to plan, and I used some of that in terms of the empirical analysis. So a brief description of the plans. So here in this table, I have the first column displaying Plan L, the second column displaying Plan H. Here I have the coinsurance below the annual maximum benefit, so that depends a bit on the category of care. And I also have the average coinsurance, sort of taking a weighted average across these categories. And so you can see that preventive care is covered by 100% regardless of which plan you're on. Basic care 85%, major care 50%. Oral surgery has a bit more generous coverage on Plan H than Plan L, but it's a relatively rare type of claim. And so in terms of averaging across all these categories, on average, Plan L, the insurer will pay 88% of what you do. You pay the remaining. Below the annual maximum benefit on Plan H, the insurer would pay roughly 90% of what you do. You would pay the remaining up until the maximum benefit. The defining feature of these plans is really the last row of this table. That is the annual maximum benefit. If you're on Plan L, the insurer will pay on your behalf no more than $1,000 per year. If you're on Plan H, the insurer will pay on your behalf no more than $2,000 per person per year. So we could see that these kind of differences across these plans in a picture, and that's what I'll show you on the next slide. Before doing so, I just want to briefly reiterate, Plan L is free for employees, and Plan H cost of premium is roughly $65 on average if you're a single employee. It goes up if you have dependents. So to see these plans in a picture, we can look at the next slide. So here, what I'm depicting on the x-axis is your total dental expenditures, and on the y-axis is your out-of-pocket expenditures excluding premiums. So because we're excluding premiums, Plan H is going to look everywhere more generous than Plan L, so your out-of-pocket expenditures are everywhere below those on Plan L. What's important to notice here is that below the annual maximum benefit, the slopes of those lines look pretty similar, right? The coinsurance is either 88% or 90% depending on which plan you're on. The major difference across these plans is the location of that kink. The location of the kink comes in at about $1,100 if you're on Plan L. That means the insurer spent exactly $1,000 on you. You spent about $100 out of pocket, and beyond that, you're going to have to pay 100% on your own. If you're on Plan H, the insurer spends $2,000 on you. In total, you spent about $2,200 because you paid $200 out of pocket, and at that point, any care after that point is going to be paid 100% by you. We could draw these same pictures and factor in the fact that you have to pay a premium. So here we're factoring in the single premium, so $65 a year. That shifts up the Plan H line by 65. And what you see is that in an ex post sense, you would have been better off and had lower out-of-pocket costs on Plan H as long as your dental spending ended up at about $1,200 that year or more. If it was less than that, ex post, you would have been better off under Plan L. So there are a couple incentives in this setting to delay claims. The first comes from this annual nonlinear reimbursement schedule, so this maximum benefit. Once I've hit my maximum benefit, I have to pay 100% out of pocket. And so if I can just hold off on doing care until January when my benefit resets, that could be to my advantage. The second reason why you might want to delay care is this opportunity to obtain more generous insurance. So if you're on the low plan and you've hit your maximum benefit, you're delaying care anyways, you might want to delay extra care or more care knowing that you could switch to Plan H and have access to this higher maximum benefit in the following year. Subsequent to delaying care, it's obviously going to be more attractive for you to potentially switch coverage. And so that's sort of another incentive we'll be looking for evidence of here. So next I'm going to talk about some sort of simple evidence from the data trying to look to see if people adjust their behavior according to these incentives. So the first thing I'll do is I'll inspect monthly dental spending across 2 adjacent years. Limit the sample to individuals who are actually enrolled in the dental insurance for those 2 years with positive expenditures at some point during that 2-year window. I'm going to compare individuals who may have the incentive to delay claims to those with less incentive to delay claims. The way I'll define those groups, you're more incentivized to delay claims if you have a lot of spending over the 2 years. Why is that? If you have a lot of spending over the 2 years, you're more likely to have been marginal to that maximum benefit in that first year. The comparison group here are going to be people who have very little spending over the 2 years. They're much less likely to have been marginal to the maximum benefit. And here's what the picture looks like. On the x-axis, I have month of the calendar year, starting from January in year 1 all the way to December of year 2, with January of year 2 being drawn in here with a vertical reference line. On the y-axis, I have the normalized fraction of total spending across that 2-year window, such that a flat line at 1 would denote equal spending in every month. The blue line here is the comparison group. The red line here is the more incentivized group. And what you see is that for the comparison group, there's sort of a noisy series right about 1, telling us that they have roughly equal spending in every month of that 2-year window. But for the incentivized group, we see something quite different. We see sort of more dramatic patterns emerge. It looks like spending spikes in January of year 2, exactly coincident with a reset of their insurance annual maximum benefit, and that spending is elevated for several months afterwards. It looks like this excess mass in spending is coming from the end of the prior year, coincident with their incentives here to potentially delay care from the end of year 1 to the beginning of year 2. So I take this as sort of suggestive evidence that it seems to be that people are adjusting behavior to conform with the incentives in the setting and delay care. One natural question that I think is that you might ask here is sort of, are there certain types of procedures that are delayed systematically more often than others? And I'll look at this using 2 different characterizations for procedure heterogeneity. One is a time sensitivity measure that I come up with a kind of a data-driven approach. And the other is looking at sort of aggregate high-level procedure categories. So I'll show you both of these. A bit more information on the time sensitivity measure. There's more details in the paper, but the basic intuition behind this measure is that if dental problems are arriving at a roughly constant rate, you might imagine that the most time-sensitive problems are going to appear roughly equally frequently throughout the months within that 2-year window. However, if on the other hand, a problem is not particularly urgent, you might imagine treatments to be distorted by the insurance incentives and be overrepresented in Q1 of year 2 amongst that incentivized group. So I come up with a way to characterize how overrepresented our procedures in Q1 of year 2 for that incentivized group and use that to measure time sensitivity. So a time-sensitive procedure is going to look sort of equally distributed throughout the year relative to the time insensitive procedures and the not time-sensitive procedures, which will look like there might be more bunching going on. And the idea is that if this categorization reveals starkly different patterns, that tells us that different types of there is true differences across procedures. They're not all equally urgent. If instead this categorization reveals patterns that are very similar across the two categories, it tells us there's not a lot of differences potentially across different types of procedures systematically in the data. So here's what it looks like in a picture. So the blue lines here are representing the relatively time-sensitive procedures. The dashed blue line is for the incentivized group. The solid blue line is for the comparison group. And you can see that regardless of whether you're in the comparison group or in the incentivized group, what you see is that these relatively time-sensitive procedures are arriving at roughly an equal rate over this 2-year window. We see sort of a noisy line bouncing right around 1. That's in stark contrast to what's going on with procedures characterized here as not very time sensitive. What we see going on there is among the incentivized group sort of stark patterns associated with potentially strategic delay, a depression of spending in the end of year 1 and an increase in the beginning of year 2. But among the comparison group, we see no such time shifting. So it's not sort of just seasonality in these types of procedures where people do them more in January, February, March than they do at the end of the calendar year. It seems to be that we only find this pattern happening amongst those individuals that have insurance incentives to delay care. I think another natural question you might ask is what types of procedures are making up the blue lines versus the green lines, and do they conform with our priors about what is ex ante delayable in this setting? So I could tell you a little bit more about that. I have a table on this in the appendix of the paper. But basically, the procedures that are characterized as time sensitive are procedures like the removal of impacted teeth or root canal therapy, things that a dentist might tell you are often painful and often urgent. Whereas the procedures that make up that relatively not time-sensitive category are going to be things like crowns and dentures, which a dentist might also tell you are not particularly urgent in many cases. Another way to look at heterogeneity here is to look at high-level procedure categories. So here are 4, diagnostic, preventive, restorative, and other. Other is going to include oral surgery, endodontics, periodontics. And what we see here is that the patterns are more stark in terms of what looks like strategic claim timing for restorative care and other care, and we don't see much going on for diagnostic and preventive care. That's not super surprising, given that much of the diagnostic and preventive care in this setting is done sort of on a routine schedule, and there wouldn't be a lot of therapeutic benefit to piling up services. Another way to kind of think about the issues that I brought up in the beginning in terms of this type of asymmetric information in this setting is to look to see whether or not individuals are switching coverage based on their potentially delayed stock of claims, or delayed stock of untreated health problems. And so one way to try to test for that is to do a joint test of sort of any asymmetric information in this setting, and that is to look for positive correlation between the claims that individuals could have had they been on the more generous coverage and their choice of the more generous coverage. So taking advantage of the fact there are 2 plans here and people, households select across these 2 plans. So what do I see here in this table? Column 1 is telling me that there is a positive correlation between claims and coverage in this setting. And column 2 tells me that after I put in household fixed effects, there's still a positive correlation. That's telling us that as households transition to the more generous coverage, they're coincidentally also having more claims. As they transition off the more generous coverage, they're having less claims. This is sort of a joint test for any dynamic asymmetric information in this setting. It doesn't necessarily tell us that it has to be ex post adverse selection. So I want to get sort of more suggestive evidence that this is plausibly driven by strategic claim delay. And to do so, I zoom in on what's going on with monthly dental expenditures amongst those people who switched to the more generous coverage. And so here's a picture of that. In January of year 2, people have switched from Plan L to Plan H. And amongst those switchers, you see that dental expenditures go up quite a bit. There's an increase that's fairly large in magnitude. It's about a 50% increase in terms of the baseline mean dental expenditures that is happening exactly coincident with these individuals switching from Plan L to Plan H. So overall, collectively, these descriptive figures and tables, I think, tell us that there seems to be some optimization that consumers are doing surrounding these incentives, and it seems to be evidence of strategic delay and subsequently people using that information to select coverage. What I'm going to do next is tell you about a model that I developed and estimate in order to explicitly link these two phenomena together. Before doing so, I had worked in a pause, so if there happen to have been any questions or if anyone wants to speak up with questions, I'd be happy to answer them now, or I could keep going and you could hold them till the end.
So let's just pause, and if you have been following, fine. If you have any questions of clarification, that would be a great time. I suppose I'm a little bit lost about the incentivized versus the non-incentivized. I saw in the figures that there was a cutoff of a $1,400 expenditure that you were using to say someone's incentivized. Could you go back over that point?
Yeah, no problem. Let me just go back to the slide as well, the initial slide. Sorry, I should have said. So the idea here is that if across the 2-year window you had a lot of expenditures, I could vary this cutoff. I chose 1,400 for this particular figure, but I could draw it with 1,200 or 1,600 or whatever. But basically the idea is if you have a lot more spending over this window, you're much more likely to have been close to that maximum benefit in the first year. And so you're more likely to have had the incentive to put off care from the end of one year to the beginning of the next. If you have less than $1,400 worth of expenditures, or in general just like low expenditures over the 2-year period, you're more likely to have been far from that maximum benefit in the first year. Basically, I don't want to condition on people's expenditures in that first year directly, because that is going to, without looking at the 2-year span overall or pooling across the 2 years, because that could be sort of an endogenous decision. I want to sort of think about 2 types of individuals, those who are sort of high spenders and those who are low spenders, and the high spenders are more likely to have been hitting up against this constraint of the maximum benefit in the first year, and that's what I'm doing here. Does that make sense?
I thought it would have worked out the other way. If I see the 2-year window, I'm conditioning on the dependent variable of claim timing, because I'm going to claim time to get my spending up above 1,400. I'm not looking at it the way you are, though. Maybe do one more time and then we'll move on.
Yeah. So if you're a low, let's just take the extreme example. Let's say you're sort of a low spending guy that over this 2-year window, you spent $500 on dental. I guess I'm a low spending guy by that definition. I rarely do anything but my normal checkups. So if I'm that kind of person, the annual max of benefit is completely irrelevant for the types of things that I do. And so for those individuals, we'd expect to see sort of equally distributed care across the year. But for individuals who are generally high spending, they're going to be bumping up against that constraint, maybe every year, maybe occasionally. And so what I'm trying to sort of pick up by pooling across the 2 years and picking sort of high spending individuals, what I'm saying is that those individuals are more likely to have had this constraint be binding than the folks who are sort of low spending individuals more generally. That's the idea. I could have created an omitted category and said, let's just look at people with spending over 1,400 and spending, and then the comparison group people with spending less than 500. I could have done something like that. There's no particular rhyme or reason why this is a perfect cutoff or something like that. And in fact, in the paper, I use many different cutoffs, and they all look these sort of broadly similar patterns.
Great, that helps. And I see no other questions, so let's just go on.
Okay. Let me skip back to where I was then. Okay, so next I'll talk about the model. And so what I'm doing with the model is I'm modeling the decision to delay claims between 2 adjacent years when insurance choices are locked. And so what I'm going to be focusing on here is the decision to delay claims as opposed to the decision to buy more generous insurance. And then I'm going to calibrate parameters with regard to risk aversion to later bring in that choice to buy more insurance in the counterfactual analysis. In doing this model, I'm going to explicitly account for delay costs. So this is going to rationalize any rigidities that might make someone reluctant to delay care, like pain or inconvenience associated with delaying care. And then I'm going to use the model to estimate the distribution of dental risk in the population and the distribution of delay costs in the population. The model has two basic components, what I call the cost model and the decision model. The cost model models the frequency at which dental problems arise and the costliness of treating those problems. And the decision model models the decision to optimally delay care. There are two simplifying assumptions that I make. One is that the relevant time horizon for this delay decision is just these 2 years. I could work in a longer time horizon, and I do in robustness analysis, but it doesn't really matter. So for simplicity, the baseline scenario is thinking about these 2 years. And then the second simplifying assumption is that there's no static moral hazard. So there are no optional procedures and not procedures that you're going to do never. I'm going to be focusing on the decision to do procedures now or later as opposed to now or never. So the outline of the timing of the model is as follows. Let's think about it for one individual, and then I'll tell you how I aggregate up across individuals. So from a single individual's perspective, that individual is going to learn their year 1 dental problems. They're going to decide how many to treat this year and how many to put off to next year, and then the claims are going to be incurred. In year 1, you're going to have to treat anything you haven't moved to the following year for treatment, and in year 2, you're going to treat any moved problems from year 1 and any new problems that arise. In terms of the cost model, I model the frequency at which dental problems arise, and that's going to follow a Poisson process that's going to be a function of your individual risk type, lambda I. There's going to be a cost intensity distribution going on in the background, so basically how costly are each one of these problems that arise, and that's going to be an IID draw from the empirical distribution of claims that I see in the data for people that are on the same age bin as you. And that's going to capture the fact that the types of dental problems that arise for older people are not the same as the types of dental problems that arise for younger people. The total cost of treating all the problems that arrive in a given year T is just going to be the sum of the costs across all the claims that have arrived that year. I'm going to assume that utility has a constant absolute risk aversion form here, and individuals are going to solve the following problem. They're going to choose the amount to delay, M, and the amount that they want to save, S, to maximize the sum of their current year utility and their expected second year utility. So let me go over what goes into this. So in their current year utility, they have to pay some sort of out-of-pocket cost, and it's going to be, it depends on Plan J that they're on, and it's going to be a function of the dental problems that arise in year 1 minus any that they put off treating to year 2, M. They're going to have to pay a delay cost for delaying care, M amount of care to the next year. So that's going to rationalize any pain or rigidities that they might face, inconvenience associated with delaying care. They're going to be permitted to save to the following year as well or borrow. In terms of next year's utility, in year 2, they're again going to have to pay out-of-pocket costs associated with being on Plan J. That's going to be a function of whatever problems will arise for them. So that's a random variable there, D2 tilde, plus any delayed care from the prior year, M. And then they're going to get their savings back from the prior year. Importantly here, we're taking expectation. The person does not know what problems will arise in the following year, but they can take an expectation that's conditional on their risk type and conditional on what they know about the types of claims that arise for individuals their age. Individuals are going to be choosing how much to delay here, and they're doing this based on this delay cost function. So this delay cost function, I'm going to assume, takes the following form. You pay sort of a fixed amount alpha I if you delay any amount of claims and 0 otherwise. It's going to be clear why I choose this form in just a moment. The possible delay amounts that people are considering, I restrict here for 2 reasons. One is sort of practicality. There are rigidities people face in reality, but the other is also from the standpoint of computational simplicity. So what I do here is I assume individuals can only move expenses claim by claim. You can't move sort of half a filling to 1 calendar year. And then individuals cannot manipulate the claim orders. So people are deciding sort of at what point are they going to cut off their claims and move the rest of them to next year as opposed to sort of shifting around the ordering of their claim. there are multiple ways to think about sort of heterogeneity across individuals in terms of the delay cost parameter. And so two ways that you might want to think about it is that it could vary across people because of individual characteristics. It could be that some people are just more cognitively able than others and they understand the insurance incentives better. It could be that some people are just more patient because they're pain tolerant, so they're willing to sort of forego care for now and engage with it later. Another reason why this may differ across individuals is that there's different procedures that arrive for individuals. Some procedures might be inherently more urgent than others, and we saw some suggestive evidence of that in the figures I showed you a moment ago. So I'm going to allow for both of these things potentially and project this delay cost heterogeneity onto individual and procedure characteristics so we can think about both of these channels. In terms of heterogeneity, I'm going to allow heterogeneity in two parameters, in the risk parameter, so the arrival of dental problems parameter, and the delay cost parameter alpha. So in terms of the risk parameter lambda, it's going to be a log normal draw from a distribution where the mean of that distribution is going to vary depending on your individual characteristics like age, gender, and your prior dental history. And for the delay cost parameter, I'm going to make the stark assumption that it's either costless for you to delay claims, so free for you to delay claims, or it's prohibitively expensive. You cannot delay claims. Your delay cost is infinite. And so the probability that it's free for you to delay claims, I'm going to call the delay probability, and it's going to be a function of your individual characteristics like age and gender, but it's also going to be a function of the characteristics of the marginal procedure that you were considering that year. So it's going to be the procedure that would have just put you over that maximum benefit if all of your claims across this 2-year period had been grouped into sort of year 1. And so that's going to pick up the both individual and procedure characteristics that may be associated with your propensity to delay. Okay. I estimate collectively the set of parameters that govern the distributions of lambda and alpha through simulated maximum likelihood, and this is what I ended up getting. Sorry, this table is smaller than I envisioned it being when I thought the slides might fill the whole screen here, so I apologize for that. Let me just tell you what's in the table and the important parts of it. So the top half of the table tells us about the parameters that govern the risk type distribution, lambda, and the bottom half of the table tells us about this delay probability. And probably in terms of an interesting summary measure, you want to look to the very last line of the table, which tells us the mean delay probability across these 4 different specifications. So the most parsimonious specification is column 1. The most saturated specifications are column 3 and 4 that allow for a lot more heterogeneity. But across these specifications, we get sort of similar qualitative findings. We find that somewhere between 36% and 45% of people delay claims when they have insurance incentives to do so in this setting. So there's quite a lot of strategic delay. We can project this kind of delay probability onto individual characteristics, and when we do that, what we see is something sort of interesting. We see that women are much more likely to delay claims than men. And we also see that older people, those over 50, are much more likely to delay claims than those folks that are younger. We can look at the types of procedures, and there's no sort of surprise here in terms of heterogeneity. I kind of gave it all away with those claim timing figures a moment ago. But basically, the procedures that are deemed least time sensitive are going to be the ones most likely to delay, according to that measure that I talked about in an earlier slide. And also in terms of the high-level procedure categories, the omitted category diagnostic care and preventive care are less likely to be delayed than restorative care and other care, including endodontics, periodontics, and oral surgery. So I take these estimates and I use them to try to do counterfactual analysis, to try to understand sort of what are the basic moving sort of policy instruments that may address this type of behavior. In doing so, what I'm going to do is I'm going to think about counterfactuals that are outside of the scope of this firm's dental benefits. The reason why is I'm not particularly interested in the market for these funny products that have this $1,000 maximum benefit or so. What I'm interested in understanding is why there is no market for more comprehensive insurance. And so what I'm going to think about is a hypothetical market for comprehensive dental insurance. It's actually a missing market, one that we don't see operate now. And I'm going to ask the question, can this phenomenon explain why we don't see this market operate currently? And in doing so, I'm going to think specifically about 2 types of counterfactuals. One of them is going to investigate the contractability of information. So can insurers contract on no information, or can they contract on all sorts of information like the individual's risk type or the pre-existing problems? I'm also going to look at enrollment frequency restrictions. Can people re-enroll in insurance annually, every 2 years, once every 5 years, or once in a lifetime? I'm going to simulate 10 years worth of coverage choices and delay decisions. And I'm going to numerically calculate an equilibrium when insurers break even and under various premium subsidies. When I look at premium subsidies, I'm going to be thinking about a premium subsidy that's funded by a tax where the marginal deadweight loss of that tax is 25%. So here's one table describing the information contractability counterfactuals. And so in this table, I have the insurance enrollment, the percent of individual years insured, the annual mean insured cost, and the annual per capita welfare, both in dollars and in terms of percent of the first best for several scenarios. Each column is describing a different set of information that the insurer can contract on. So column 1 is a setting where insurers can contract on no information. So there's both traditional adverse selection and there's ex post adverse selection. Column 2 is when the insurer can contract on permanent risk types. So this removes traditional adverse selection, and what we're left with is ex post adverse selection. Column 3 does exactly the inverse. The insurers are allowed to exclude coverage for pre-existing problems. So this removes ex post adverse selection, but we can still have adverse selection based on permanent risk types. And the 4th column gets us to the first best. There's symmetric information. The insurer can contract on both pre-existing risk types and pre-existing problems and permanent risk types. And so 100% of people enroll in insurance. The mean insured cost is $241, and we see that the per capita welfare is $79. So $79 sounds pretty small, but in terms of relative to the size of the market, the mean insured cost here is again $241, and so it's about 33% of the mean insured cost, which is fairly sizable in terms of the maximum welfare here at stake. So let's zoom in on a particular set of counterfactuals. The counterfactuals related to unsubsidized market, so a market with no subsidy. We can look at column 1 and see that there's massive unraveling in this market. Only 2% of individual years would be insured if insurers can't contract on any information. The mean cost of those insured lives in each year they're insured is $1,800, so extremely high. There seems to be sort of a lot of adverse selection going on here, and the per capita welfare associated with that counterfactual is $28 per person. So we can compare this to a scenario where we incrementally either remove traditional adverse selection by moving from column 1 to column 2, or remove ex post adverse selection by moving from column 1 to column 3. So let's first think about the thought experiment of removing traditional adverse selection. So moving from column 1 to column 2. What we see is if we remove traditional adverse selection, we roughly double insurance enrollment from 2% to 4.8%, and insured costs go down from $1,800 per person to about $1,200 per person. We see welfare analogously also goes up from $28 per person to about $43 per person. So we get quite a bit of improvement removing traditional adverse selection, but it turns out that that's less improvement than we would have gotten if we removed ex post adverse selection. To see that, compare column 1 to column 3. If we remove ex post adverse selection, we get that insurance enrollment goes up from 2% to 12.3%, so a much bigger sort of increase, a 6-fold increase rather than a doubling. We also see insured costs go down from $1,800 per person to $576 per person. So, and analogously, we see welfare goes up as well from $28 per person to $50 per person, which amounts to about 63% of the first best that we could achieve in this market. And so the qualitative takeaway to take away from this table is that it seems to be that ex post adverse selection based on the strategic delay is at least as important in terms of explaining market unraveling and in terms of its impact on welfare as traditional adverse selection based on differences in permanent risk types across individuals in this particular setting. I also look at sort of the impact of how frequently people can reselect insurance and how that might impact ex post adverse selection. In this set of counterfactuals, I think about a scenario where the insurer can price your permanent risk type, lambda, and so basically that is removing traditional adverse selection and really zooming in on this ex post adverse selection story. And so here I consider several scenarios: annual contracts, contracts where people enroll every 2 years, every 5 years, and once in a lifetime. So let's once again zoom in on an unsubsidized market here and compare these scenarios. If there's annual enrollment, we see quite a bit of unraveling. We have 4.8% of individual years are insured for a cost of about $1,200 a year. we can compare that to moving to 2-year contracts. If there were 2-year contracts, that would go up quite a bit to 13.3% of individual years insured at a cost of $591 per person, getting us $56 or so per person in terms of welfare. That goes up quite a bit more if we move to 5-year contracts, where roughly 38% of people would be insured for the much more reasonable mean insured cost of $328 per capita, getting us $71 in welfare per person, or about 90% of what we can maximally get, which would amount to sort of lifetime contracts, the first best in this setting. So there are a few takeaways here. It looks like sort of increasing the length of contracts, even moving from annual contracts to contracts that are once every 2 years, vastly improves welfare relative to sort of other types of interventions you might be able to do. So if we compare the no subsidy row to the 25% subsidy row and stay in column 1, what you see is that introducing a 25% subsidy would move up insurance enrollment from 4.8% to 11.4%, but that's a smaller increase than we would have gotten if we just simply double the length of contracts. So increasing the length of contracts seems to be sort of a very powerful lever here in terms of improving insurance enrollment, reducing selection, and improving welfare. Also, an interesting takeaway here is that we get most of the way there in terms of welfare if we move to 5-year contracts. We don't have to go all the way to the first best lifetime contracts. Going to 5-year contracts helps with a strategic delay problem significantly in this setting. So in terms of concluding, in the context of dental care, what I think I've learned here is the degree of strategic delay that individuals engage in may explain the largely missing market for dental insurance that we see in the United States. Policies aimed at extending the length of contracts, things like working to get more enforceable long-term contracts or having less frequent open enrollment periods, may be especially important to overcome this kind of strategic behavior. And it seems to be that the more general takeaway is that strategic delay and the associated ex post adverse selection may motivate many of the contract features that we see used by insurers in practice, and may explain why some risks are quite difficult to insure. Because this is sort of a paper that's been around for quite a long time, this is the first time I'm actually discussing a paper that is already published. I want to mention that there are subsequent papers that have sort of built on this and looked for this type of phenomenon in other settings. And so there's a few recent papers that have shown evidence building upon this work, looking at strategic claim delay in related contexts, for instance, in health insurance and prescription drug insurance. So if you're interested in this topic, I would recommend looking at those very nice papers as well. And with that, I'll sort of wrap up and ask if there are any questions.
Okay, I'm going to keep my eye on the chat box to see if there are any questions. I guess since the paper's been out, I'm curious about what the epilogue is on uptake of these policy maneuvers. If there's enough competition in the dental insurance market, perhaps innovation might have been spurred. Maybe you got some inquiries from insurance executives or benefits managers about your policies, about changing the length of the term or trying to modify the beneficiary's ability to do this type of claim timing.
That's a great question. So in terms of the most direct answer is I don't think that there's been like a lot of fundamental changes going on in this market. That said, I think one thing that is sort of interesting is that we see that insurers often try to use instruments that more generally combat this type of behavior, right? It's not uncommon that prior to the Affordable Care Act, you would see insurers implementing long waiting periods for insurance, for health insurance, for instance. So it's great that you want insurance, sure, we'll sign you up, but your effective date is 6 months from now, right? The Affordable Care Act actually limited waiting periods to much shorter than that, I think a period of no more than 90 days. But prior to that, you saw insurers trying to use these kind of instruments that kind of tell you that they were very worried about strategically delayed care and the fact that people would use that knowledge to sign up for insurance. In terms of within the dental space itself, an interesting sort of aspect of dental is that there's basically virtually no individual market. It's almost all through employer provided insurance. And so you might think in some ways that might help the employer market sort of overcome some of this adverse selection. That said, you might also worry that, since dental insurance is relatively rare in the sense that only 40% of people have it, there are many people who have uninsured years when it comes to dental. And so if you're sort of onboarding a new employee, they may have sort of $20,000 worth of dental work they've been accumulating over time that they haven't treated yet. And you might be worried about being the only employer out there that's offering sort of very generous coverage. And so an interesting product that I've seen talk of in this space is having sort of maximum benefits that you can accumulate over time. So if you didn't use your full maximum benefit this year, you might be able to add that to next year's maximum benefit to sort of allow benefits to be stocked up over time to provide more insurance to people, but sort of try to still overcome this delay incentive.
Yeah, that's connected to the answer you promised to give us, which is to help connect claim timing to the low ceilings of coverage. And I think an extension of your work would ask, if we could control this with longer-term contracts, could we raise the ceiling and offer more generous insurance for higher higher caps? So I think that might be our last question. If you could just address that, and then we might close.
Yeah. So formally in the model that I went through in the counterfactuals, I did not have a competing product that looks more like the products that we see today with this sort of low caps. That said, I think the counterfactuals, what they do tell us is that there could be a functioning market for more comprehensive insurance for this risk if it were not for the strategic claim timing. So I think that the implication of that is that, one reason why we might not see these kinds of policies in practice, and we might see this sort of funny policies with the low maximum benefit, is exactly because insurers are worried, and employers in this case who are contracting insurers are worried about people having delayed care from one year to the next, because it seems like a first order phenomenon in this setting. Going back to the model estimates, depending on your favorite specification, it looks like somewhere between 36% and 45% of people delay claims when they're incentivized to do so, which is just sort of a very large number any way you cut it.
Well, great. I'm so grateful to you and to our audience for coming. I've learned a lot, and if you're watching this webinar any weeks or months from now, I think you'll understand why we thought this work was so important to share with our members. So without any further, I'd like to again thank you, Marika, for a wonderful presentation, and I wish you all the best.
Thanks, David, and thanks for the opportunity to share my work.
Okay, bye.